chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. That is on page 845 in your Pew Bible if you want to follow along. I think this one was picked for me. I have a sister, maybe two, maybe four. Brothers.
So do I.
Jesus visits Martha and Mary. Now as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her.
The old First Church in the Common in Rockhaven, Maine. Which means that actually things slow down a bit for Reverend Williams. So he's been taking this kind of downtime, if you will, to catch up on some of his not so urgent pastoral calls. The old First Church, like other churches in the area of Rockhaven, sees an influx of summer visitors. Many of them will come and stay for weeks, a couple of months even during the summer, and a few of them are retired clergy. It baffles me why so many retired clergy have chosen the area of Rockhaven. It defies logic. I mean, we're not known as a community with great cultural opportunities. That is, unless you count the last Friday of the month, when they have the multicultural potluck over at the Senior Center in Sheridan. Oh yes, this is the height of our ethnic culture. Why, just last month, Mabel Bailey brought an authentic Chinese dish, chop suey. Now, really, she did, and the thing is, no one ate it. Because she actually did the research and found that authentic Asian chop suey is made with bean sprouts and cabbage and celery over rice and crispy rice noodles and not elbow macaroni. Boss Barstow looked at it and said it looked like a bowl of fried earthworms. Well, having this abundance of retired spiritual and religious resources years ago became the custom to invite these various vicars to preach on a Sunday during the summer months. And they would offer their different theological and ecclesiastical viewpoints expressed through these guest parsons. Was made it interesting for the folks to go to First Church during the summer, but that's another sermon, another story. At the First Church, the first summer Reverend Williams was there, at church council, when they were met in June, old Sam Coleridge informed the Reverend. He said, Reverend, we've got 6 Sundays all taken care of this summer with guest ministers. So take some vacation time for yourself, but just make sure that you stay around during the week in case of emergency. So he says, so let me get this straight. I don't have to preach for 6 Sundays, but don't leave town. And that's right, Pastor, Clara French chimed in. Said, besides, if I have a sermon to write, what else do you have to do during the week? Beth, Imogene Reynolds' sister, was part of the committee, and she just sat there and she smiled. She was rummaging through her purse and looking for something, and as she did, a couple of those little lifesavers, the individual lifesavers fell out onto the floor, and she scooped them up and put them back in. She keeps them there for the children in worship, if they get a little bored or whatever during worship time. So anyway, Reverend Williams taking some time for himself, but still being on call. Reverend, as I said, has been taking a few weeks this summer to catch up on his pastoral calling obligations. One of the first calls he made was to go out and see Jeanette and Pappy Holman. He pulled up this very steep, washed-out gravel driveway to their old 12 by 60 mobile home on the Carter's Hill Road. Jeanette wasn't home that morning. B. Stearns had driven her over to Uniondale to an audiologist to see about getting her antiquated hearing aids adjusted a little bit. But as he knocked on the door, old Pappy hollered out from somewhere inside the 1960s vintage mobile home, "Come on in! Door's open." Pappy invited the Reverend to have a seat at the kitchen table. Didn't know when Jeanette would be back, but wanted no reason why they couldn't sit around and shoot the well. Pappy wasn't one to be called a hypocrite, mind you. The language he used every day, he used with the preacher. Reverend noticed that while it was very small and confined, the Holman's mobile home had a cozy feel to it. It felt like a home, or at least he felt at home in it. And in fact, he felt so much at home that he found himself helping himself to the peanuts that were in a small candy jar on the kitchen table. Well, they went on, they shoot the breeze for an hour or so, and he says, the Reverend says, "Well, it's about time for me to leave. I've got to go on and see someone else." He stood to leave, and feeling right at home, he grabbed another handful of nuts for his way out the door, and he looked and he'd eaten just about all of them. He noticed Pappy hadn't had one. Offering an apology for being so inconsiderate, Pappy just looked at him rather slyly, with that little grin on his face. He said, "Don't you worry about that, Rev. Without my teeth, all I can do is suck the chocolate off of them." Well, to this day, Reverend Williams doesn't know if Pappy was pulling his leg or not. But still, it was a good visit. Well, the word got out in town that the Reverend was making the rounds, and some of the members began preparing for the Reverend's call. Some had been preparing for days now, and they're hanging by the phone just waiting for that call. Although it has also gotten out that he's just as apt to stop by unannounced. Why, he'd even stopped by the Holmans and spent some time with Pappy when Jeanette wasn't home. They wondered what in the world the Reverend and Pappy would have to talk about. Limogene Reynolds she's even gone so far as to open up her front parlor in anticipation of the Reverend's visit. That parlor hasn't seen the light of day or a feather duster in nearly 15 years. That was when she hosted the welcoming party for Reverend Theodore Quinley. It wasn't Teddy. It wasn't even Theodore. It was Reverend Quinley. Well, Reverend Quinley didn't last very long, about a year. He was a nervous fellow, and he liked to quote Bible verses, flaunting his seminary education. One Sunday morning, shortly after he arrived, he had chosen a new hymn, so that Sunday morning he went by Clara French's house, the organist, just to go over the hymn a little bit before they used it in worship. It was obvious when he pulled in that Clara was home, her car was there, but all of his knocking on the door brought no one to the front door. As much as he tried to knock, no one came. So he took out one of his little business cards, and on the back of it he wrote Revelations 3:20 and stuck it in the door. Well, later that service, during the service later that morning, after the service, Reverend Quinley was going through the prayer cards that people put in the offering plate. And here, mixed in with the prayer cards, was his business card. And sure enough, right there was his Revelation 30, but underneath it, they put in Genesis 3:10. Well, for those of you who can't remember, quote your Bible right off the top of your head, Revelation 3:20 says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and open the door, I will come into them." And Genesis 3:10 says, "And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked." As I said, Reverend Quinley didn't last very long. One morning, Reverend Williams he decided to call on Miss Susie. She didn't have a telephone, but the chances were she would be at home, usually tending to her vegetable garden or her little flock of chickens. But to get to the Slabtown area where Miss Susie lived, the Reverend had to actually drive out of Rockhaven and then back into it. So we found Miss Susie, as expected, in her yard, throwing some cracked corn out to her hands. And expressing her surprise and pleasure at seeing the Reverend, he noticed that she didn't invite him in, or rather led him around the corner of a rickety old woodshed out to her garden. And on the way, she stopped at a well and hand pumped out a tin pitcher of water, offering him some and then taking a sip for herself. My, so that was a good one. Good one. The two walked around, and through the verdant abundance that is Miss Susie's garden, there were beans, Kentucky Wonder, yellow wax beans, Jacob cattle beans for drying. There were cucumbers, the pickling type, and the long, slender Berkless type. There was corn, and there were tomatoes of various varieties, peppers of assorted colors, and more. The garden was all ringed and ringed with a many-hued rows of nasturtiums. The Reverend looked at it and said, "So this is where that wonderful relish begins." Miss Susie spoke of how, as much as she enjoys being in the beautiful sanctuary of Old First Church on the Common, this is where she felt God the most. There was many a long talk with God that took place in that garden, she told him. Miss Susie spoke in simple terms, yet with a soulful passion about her God, and to the Reverend William, it seemed like Susie wasn't talking about the God he'd learned about in seminary, but about someone that Miss Susie was on a first-name basis with and had been acquainted with all of her life. It was a very good visit, and the Reverend bounced his little hybrid back down the long dirt drive, and he knew that he had been ministered to as much as he had ministered to Miss Susie. Well, later that week, Reverend Williams contacted the Flanagans, decided he was going to stop by one afternoon to see them. He was especially looking forward to seeing little Bobby. See how little Bobby was doing after his most recent doctor's visit. Little Bobby was born with a heart defect, a hole in his heart actually, and he had had several surgeries over the years. Reverend Williams was taken aback when he was met at the door by this strapping adolescent fellow. He would see them in church, but to see Bobby in these circumstances in his home, he was surprised at how much he had grown. He wasn't the same little boy who, when years ago, when Reverend Williams first arrived at the church, they met him at the door, kind of eyed him up and down. And then during the children's message, little Bobby came down, and not being used to, that was during those days that Reverend Williams wore a clerical collar. And not being used to seeing a pastor in their work uniform like that, Bobby asked, "Why do you dress so funny?" Well, the Reverend said, "This is what I wear when I work." Bobby, still puzzled, looked at his neck and said, "Do you have a boo-boo?" The Reverend, somewhat puzzled, finally figured out Bobby was looking at his collar, and so he reached in and he pulled out the collar and showed the boy that it was a little white strip of plastic. And on the inside, there were these letters that say, "Wash in warm soapy water." And Reverend Williams asked Bobby, "Do you know what these say?" And knowing full well that Bobby couldn't read, he was just kind of curious as to what they say. Bobby looked at it and said, "I sure do know what that says." It's kind of taken aback. The Reverend says, "Okay, then what do these words say?" Bobby looked the pastor right in the eye and he said to him, "Pills, fleas, and ticks for up to 6 months." Well, next Monday, the Reverend musters up his courage and he calls Imogene Brown's. Sets up a time to stop by. Imogene is very cordial. And she says, "Oh yes, and by the way, Reverend, would it be all right if my sister Beth would like to join us?" Well, as the pastor pulls into Imogene's driveway, he notices the curtains swing back over one of the windows very quickly. And before he can get to the first step, Imogene is opening the door and directing the Reverend through the kitchen, through the little den where there was a television and a couple of very comfortable chairs, into the front parlor. There was a coffee table, and it was spread with all sorts of goodies. Most of them, he could tell, came from his bakery. In the middle, Reverend spied a candy bowl with chocolate-covered nuts, and his stomach began to churn. Beth comes in from another side room and sits down on the heirloom settee and strikes up a conversation with the Reverend. She's very interested in how he's doing in the church and how he feels the church is doing, and how's his family doing, his parents and his grandparents. What was it like for him growing up, and where he grew up, and did he have any siblings, and what did he think of their little town and their church, and how nice it was to have him there, and what were some of his dreams and desires for the church. Meanwhile, Imogene scurrying back and forth, parlor to kitchen. When she finally came in to stay for a bit, she brought in some coffee in a very elegant crystal carafe with matching crystal coffee cups, and the Reverend couldn't help but notice that she carefully set them down next to this very large family heirloom Bible that must have been 100 years old. Yet the cover and binding looked as if she had just unwrapped it. Imogene broke into the conversation with questions about church affairs, like the recent disbanding of the clearing committee. And had he noticed the bare patches at the Clarice May Bradley Stemple Memorial Garden? Did he think they were grubs? And if so, did she know she knew someone that could come in and treat it for a good price? What did he think about the deacon's idea of serving communion by infraction? She meant intinction. But she didn't know what to think about that. She'd been to her cousin's church in Portland when they did this infliction thing, and she didn't know what she thought about seeing all those floaty things in the cup. And what was he going to do about the youth and what they had done to the walls of the youth room? And speaking of the rooms in the church, the kitchen needed some new salt and pepper shakers, and not this plastic, these plastic picnic ones from the Pass the Buck store. Some real ones, some crystal ones. And had you heard about what the Baptist Church had done over Pine Plains, had done to their sanctuary? Screen and guitars. My word. Have you ever think about, Reverend, did you know? Reverend, did you know? But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. Few things are necessary. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her. Reverend's eyes sort of glazed over. Beth sat there and she smiled. She reached into her purse and offered the Reverend a lifesaver. It was going to be